So I think it's very useful to see those films in sequence because it gives, I think, everybody a sense of the range of them. But I was very interested that the actors seem to be in a bit of a competition as to whether you belong to theatre or whether you belong to film, except for Kevin Spacey, who was able to say that you belong to both. But that does lead us in, I think, to the question of what it means to have this dual existence as both a film and a theatre director. And you've said that you always want to be moving between them rather than to fix on any one form for any length of time. So could you just talk a bit about that?
Well, I suppose I've always felt like a theatre director who makes films. I've never felt entirely comfortable even saying the word action. I feel a little bit of an imposter. And for me, theatre is my home, and it's where I feel most comfortable, and it's where I feel most relaxed and at ease and myself. But once you've experienced a movie and you've gone out into the world and you've smelt different smells and seen the light and the way the light changes in cities and countries across the world and experienced different periods and the kind of scale that movies offer you, it's a very difficult drug to put down. And so every time I've done a play or maybe two plays, I get that itch, that slight tingling sensation that I need to go out from the confines of a rehearsal room and the comfort and the security and the relative stability of and you know, it's a civilized life being a theatre director. You know, you get up in a decent time in the morning and you can probably see your children and you can then go to rehearsal and you get lunch at the right time, and film is just it's just a siege. You know, you get up at a ridiculous time and you're exhausted and you're always eating the wrong things at the wrong time. And so you have to then retreat once you've done it. You feel it's a bit bruising. But the truth is that there are great similarities, but there are more differences than there are similarities between film and theatre. The similarities are that, of course, you're a storyteller in both media and you are used to telling a story to a room full of hundreds of people, hopefully. But technically, they're very different parts of your brain that you use. Film is a basically pragmatic medium, and it's fundamentally about detail and about securing every little piece of your jigsaw and then putting it to one side in a box, and then a year later taking out the jigsaw pieces and try to make the picture again, the picture that you originally had in your head. And theatre is much more organic, much more free form, but I guess I feel increasingly at home in movies these days, just by dint of repetition.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask about film influences? What has been most powerfully shaping? And is it directors or is it film particular sequences within individual films?
Are you talking about right at the beginning,
yes,
when I first started making films? Well, the first films that really influenced me were the films that I saw at university and went into sort of main artery, if you like. And they were the films of the late 80s, mid-80s, particularly I think of Paris, Texas and Repo Man and River's Edge, movies that created a mythic contemporary American landscape. And I suppose that's why I ended up attempting to make a mythic American story in American Beauty when I could have, I suppose at that time, would have been expected to make something more conventionally English. And so for me, those were the influences. But once I started really committing to being a film director, I started watching them in different ways. I mean, there were lots of films that had influenced me unconsciously. So, you know, the great movies of the last 20 or 30, 40 years, Taxi Driver, The Godfather, the obvious ones, really. But then I started going a little further afield and realized that in many ways, the films that I was most drawn to slightly more obscure films, Truffaut movies, Ozu, Kurosawa, Lean, Hitchcock, Visconti, Ford, you know, and those movies, I suppose I'd seen some of them, but I hadn't been aware of the director behind them so much. And the shape of those stories, for me, was everything. So much of it was about rhythm, about a director's rhythm. And I think that you tune into a director's rhythm and you love it or you don't. And I don't think sometimes that's a bad thing. But there are contemporary filmmakers, for example, Paul Thomas Anderson. I can watch almost anything by Paul. Paul Thomas Anderson, as far as I'm concerned, could film The Phone Book, and I would just be happy to sit there watching it I love the way he makes films. I love the rhythm of his films. I love the performances in his films. I love the way he moves the camera. I think there's poetry in almost everything he does. But a filmmaker who I also admire, like David O. Russell, for example, I find his movies leave me completely cold. And I've been sat with audiences full of people who were clearly loving every second of American Hustle. Or I think that you find the movie makers whose rhythm you hear, whose music sings out to you, and it is like music in that respect. You don't know why you like a particular band or a particular composer, you just do, and it's having the trusting in your own instincts to like the movies you like, not the ones you're told to like, or the ones that the critics say are the best, or the ones that win the awards. Indeed, it's the ones that speak to you individually, and I suppose I found those in that period a lot. In that period when I was looking at. I wasn't looking at films for American Beauty, but I realised what my tastes were. When you're actually in the trenches and you have to make a film, you have to make decisions about where the camera goes and how you want it to look and feel, and you're sitting with a storyboard artist, which is often the first part of the journey of trying to find a language for the movie that you've got in your head, that's when you have to make decisions. Where do you want to put the camera? Do you want it to be a composed image? Do you want it to be handheld? Do you want it to be Steadicam? Do you want this thing to move on tracks? Do you want there to be tension in the frame all the time? Do you want long takes, short takes? How do you want it to move and flow? And you have to force yourself to make those decisions very, very early. And then you translate that to the cinematographer and to everybody else who's making the movie with you, who are obviously crucial collaborators. But the very first part of the journey is between you and it. And you have to make those decisions. And you might be surprised when someone sits at a piece of paper and says, okay, what's the first shot of your movie? Describe it to me and I will draw it. It's amazing what comes out of your mouth. It's not always what you think it's going to be. Or you describe something that you think you want to see, and then you look at the picture on the page 2 days later when he delivers you this finished, nice little series of frames, and you think, I don't like that. That's not my movie. Okay, so what is my movie? And then you begin to have a dialogue with the script, in a sense, and develop out of that your vision. But until you have that, until the crunch comes, till you actually have to make a decision, where are you going to put the camera? You can talk and opine as much as you want, but you haven't really made a movie. You're not really beginning that process.
So the influence of the directors might be the rhythms that you have felt most sympathetic to, and by rhythms you mean sort of energy flows in the film, the kind of the way of tension and release, or
on the most basic level, the rhythm of a cut, how long you hold a shot for, how much you trust the actors to carry the meaning of the film, how much you're inflecting performance by how you edit. So in other words, I was talking earlier, if anyone's familiar with the movie American Beauty, there's a scene in which Annette Bening tries to sell a house, fails, and beats herself up about it. Literally, she slaps herself in the face and cries and calls herself stupid, alone in a room. And I remember the studio notes going back, why is the camera just watching her? They were really disconcerted by the fact the camera just didn't move. It didn't push in when she started to cry. It didn't show us a close-up of her tears or her wiping the tears away. It didn't give us a way to interpret the image. It just showed what was happening. And so in a sense, the stillness of the camera was saying, you decide. Is she stupid? Is it ridiculous what she's doing? Or is she moving? Do you care about her? Or do you think she's foolish? And I've always been fascinated in that dividing line between the objective and the subjective, not feeding the audience how they need to take or understand an image. And I think that the great filmmakers, a Ford or a Visconti or a Kubrick, allow the image to speak. And you have to find your way into it. They ask you to lean in, not lean back. And of course, the contemporary style more is to cut very fast and to direct an audience's attention very specifically from here to there. And I think I'm more given to movies that allow you to bathe in the atmosphere. But of course, that's very dangerous because you hold a shot 1 second too long and it's boring. And I watched the last 2/3 of Road to Perdition last night before the Q&A. There's a screening at the Phoenix, and I found myself thinking, come on, just get a move on. It's too slow, But I know for a fact that at the time I was passionately committed to the fact that was the pace of the film. That was my movie. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I look back at that younger man that made that film and think, God, I was quite impressed with him for doing that, for having the courage to just
hold it.
To hold it.
Yeah.
long takes on actors' faces, nothing being said. So, and it asks you to read the face. And one of the things I said last night, which I feel very strongly about, is also give an audience time to read complex emotions, not just simple things in the topography of a human face, which is everything in movies. And one of the sad things about the diminishment of the movie-going experience in terms of the number of movies that are being seen every year on a big screen is obviously going down every year, and it's being at the same time a golden era in television. So you're seeing, generally speaking, human faces on a much smaller scale, but there's something magnificent about an 80-foot wide human face. If they're doing something interesting, nothing can compete. No special effect can ever be quite as interesting as that, and that's something I believe in as well. Coming from the theatre is the primacy of the actor in terms of carrying the emotional heart of the story. So those things define who you are as a filmmaker, and you seek out the people that do that. But at the same time, if you ask me the movies I love, they're not movies that I could ever have made. I love Goodfellas. I love Pulp Fiction. They're both masterpieces. But if I tried to make Goodfellas, it would scream fake from the moment it started. So you have to understand that you can't mimic your masters. You can't just copy them. You have to understand who you are and make your own film. So it's not to say I only like movies, like the ones I make, because I don't. And I'd be the first person to say someone else's movie is too slow. But, sometimes that's the choice you make for your own.
I mean, you mentioned last night that you saw Hitchcock's North by Northwest as the first Bond movie, which I think is a very interesting idea. But Hitchcock hasn't otherwise come up in discussion. So I wondered if he was important for you.
Oh, yes. But Vertigo, for me, is the masterpiece and the only time he really penetrates. Well, I think maybe a little bit in Rear Window, actually, but penetrates into a darker area of his own, or a kind of admission of his own fragile psyche. He's a genius at manipulating others and manipulating the viewer and the tension of the viewer. I mean, there's no one better at building tension and surprising you and undercutting your expectations. Psycho being the obvious example. You have a central character who disappears halfway through the movie, and you are literally untethered. You have no idea who to connect to and who to care about. Where is my journey through the film? It's exactly what he wants you to feel, and that's a master at work, clearly. But he's still it's still the game is he's the cat and you're the mouse, and he's toying with you. In Vertigo, you feel he's actually going into his own insecurities, his own vulnerabilities, and exploring a man who continues to remake the same woman over and over again, which in a sense he as a filmmaker did. The same icy blonde over and over again, different actresses, the same person, the same central idea. So that fascinates me, and that is a masterpiece, unquestionably. But I also love North by Northwest, and the reason I say it's the first Bond movie is that a quote I used last night, but it's true that they asked Hitchcock, well, why do you cast movie stars? Why do you cast Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant and Grace Kelly and so on? And he said, because it saves me 10 minutes of exposition. The audience already knows Grace Kelly, already knows Cary Grant, and I'm ahead of the game. I don't have to explain what is Cary Grant about Cary Grant. And one of the great reliefs about doing Bond after 10, 15 years of genre-defying films or trying to create something that doesn't fit into any easy category was to just say, it's a Bond movie. You know what it is, I know what it is, and now I'm going to play around with that a little bit. But it's always going to be within the tenets, the structural shape of what we understand to be a Bond movie. Action sequence in the middle, action sequence at the end, action sequence in the middle, at the beginning, middle and end, a couple of sweeteners in between, two subplots, girl subplot, MI6 subplot, Q, Moneypenny, M. Everyone got it? Right. So that's the furniture. Now you have to design the house so the furniture looks like it's always been there. And so it's an act of reverse engineering, is that you're basically saying, okay, now let's go back and imagine how all these things are necessary to the story, not a given, including Bond. Bond has to be necessary to the story. He's not the given, he's not the constant, he's not the unchanging figure who just doesn't, who just remains the same, occasionally raises an eyebrow. He's somebody who actually is vulnerable in his own way and in danger of being wiped out. And you've got to try and engage an audience's, they've got to care about him again. And in Daniel, there was an actor who could sustain that. So, but the genre was always very clear. It was very straightforward. And I liked that for that time. And then, of course, it becomes a bit of a straitjacket. In the second movie, I was like, I couldn't get out of it, and then the arch supervillain comes back, and then you're even more hemmed in than you were before. So it has both pluses and minuses. But one of the reasons I admire Hitchcock is that he was able to work within the genre without it letting him define it. Everyone was original. Everyone felt fresh, even though, it was a pretty standard thriller, or, everyone had an idea at the core of it that made it feel like you'd never seen it before, even though the shape of it is actually quite conventional. The goodie finds the baddie and in the end kills him. That's basically the plot of 75% of Hitchcock's movies. But that doesn't explain Rear Window. How do you come up with that, So yes, I learned a lot from him.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I said at the beginning, started in the introduction to say that the Bond obviously are within that fixed genre, but the other films have been very much reinventing genre or mixing genres. And has that been a conscious decision that each film, in a sense, has to fit a different mould or break a different mould? Perhaps would be the better way.
No, I've never. The worst thing you can do as a filmmaker is be a crusader. Make a point about this film needs to be X or Y. I want to defy the genre. I want to break the mould. Just tell a good story. The problem with genre is that it confines your narrative choices. It's a gangster movie, so it can't have a father-son relationship. Well, who says? It's a family movie, so it can't be in the set in a world of gangsters. Well, again, who says? It's just finding an interesting story, nothing more. And I feel like you can, if you're trying to make a point about a film, we're trying to make editorialize it, make a commentary on it as you're making it, you're going to fail. If they are defying genres, then it's accidental. Of course, you avoid cliche. That's different. And the very thing that attracted me to my first and thus far only war movie was the fact that not a shot was fired in it. The central character did not shoot his gun. It was about a war, Jarhead this is, in 1991, the first Gulf War, which at the time was considered a huge success, but subsequently appears to have been the beginning of a downward spiral in the Middle East, which we are still suffering from today. And so, retrospectively, it was a disastrous war. And that irony I couldn't quite make clear in the movie, but that's what I was trying to go for, is that, yes, at the time it may have seemed sweet, but now the last line of the movie is we're still in the desert, and we still are.
Yes. No, that's great. So I think perhaps what we should do now is show the clip from American Beauty, which was the first film, and what I'm hoping is that Sam will, after we've seen it, I
better watch it then.
Talk us through it. Yes, can you not say it from there? Talk us through it a bit.
What's wrong?
Nothing.
No, you're scared of me.
No, I'm not.
You want to see the most beautiful thing I've ever filmed? It was one of those days where it's a minute away from snowing. And there's this electricity in the air. You can almost hear it, right? And this bag was just dancing with me. Like a little kid begging me to play with it. For 15 minutes. That's the day I realized that there was this entire life behind things. this incredibly benevolent force that wanted me to know that there was no reason to be afraid. Ever. Video's a poor excuse, I know. But it helps me remember. I need to remember. Sometimes there's so much beauty in the world. I feel like I can't take it. And my heart is just going to cave in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a sequence in the film that anybody who's seen it, it's stayed with them. And so perhaps I could just say what it means to me, when it means a great deal to me, because I don't know whether you would think this was nonsense, but it seemed to me to be saying, this is film as film. This is what film can do that no other medium can. And it reminds me of the discussions of very early film theorists writing about film who have a theory of what they call photogenie, which is they describe as the glimpse of beauty, as it were, which lies behind things or even between the frames. And that image, that vision, is repeated at the end of film when Lester Burnham, the Kevin Spacey character, is dying, isn't it? It comes back. And it also the sequence in Jarhead, that's extraordinary mirage, shimmering mirage in the desert when the camel train is coming towards them. And again, that is repeated at the end of the film when he says, the desert is still in me. But those moments are film qua film. They are, no other medium could produce that effect, it seems to me, although, of course, in there it's being shot through video within film. But I'd be interested to know more what it's an extraordinary sequence, what it means to you, and perhaps tell us something about its construction.
Well, the first thing to say is it's Alan Ball's idea. It's a great screenplay, and it works in a very odd way, which I don't think I fully even now quite understand. And it's I view this scene as part of a chain of scenes that are about 15 minutes in the middle of the film, which I still think is the heart of the film, followed by that scene, that dinner scene, bruising, and entirely different in tone, and then another shift of tone. And a kind of a sort of chain of events, a chain of scenes that comes off the back of this. And I feel that it works in an odd way, which is that, first of all, I told this story earlier in the masterclass, so forgive me if I repeat it, but it was a deeply prosaic way of achieving that shot, which is basically, I couldn't get it right, and eventually I ended up in a school playground at 5 a.m. in Van Nuys in LA with two grips with huge fans and me with a tiny little video camera and a plastic bag. And all the people going to school, dropping their kids to school, thinking that poor guy and his student film is clearly going horribly wrong and no one's ever going to see it. So it was quite a bizarre experience. And I still always think about that playground. And I went to that playground because I wanted the red brick wall, because when I shot it before, it didn't stand out properly. And then something else was missing the second time. I shot it 3 times. And I didn't shoot the scene that you see with Ricky and Jane watching it until I got the film of the plastic bag right. So I kept delaying the shooting of the scene because I didn't have the plastic bag looking the way I wanted it. So he couldn't respond to what he was seeing. The thing that then made it was the leaves. The leaves dance around in circles in the way that they do in the wind. And they're the foot soldiers, they're the chorus. And the plastic bag is the lead actor. But the two things interact. And so it felt like suddenly it held my attention. It held my view. And then something else happened, which is that when we came to shoot it, I set up this shot, which is a very slow push-in, which you may not even be aware of, that the camera's moving in very, very slowly. So there are, in a sense, 3 frames. There's the frame of our camera, there's the frame of the television set, and then there's the moving frame of the video camera. So there are 3 things at play. So there are 3 planes moving at the same time in an odd and unexpected way. And when the first editor was the only person on that movie, or indeed almost any movie that I fired, cut it. He cut it in a very conventional way. And he cut on, as most editors would, onto the people who were talking. And I kept saying, no, I can hear that. Just show me the bag. Just that one shot I felt could hold for a long time. And so that's how we did it. And I cut that scene myself, which I can rarely say in movies. I knew exactly how it was. It's really only 4 shots. And the other thing I should add about that scene, although you can't see, it's not a particularly good projected image here, but the lighting of Conrad Hall is unbelievable. The way that the light just touches Ricky's neck and clips her ear and her earring, the sense of being inside when the soft sun is dying outside, the sense of being both inside and outside, the poetry in it is absolutely, I mean, that's the sort of thing that only a master cinematographer could achieve. I didn't ask him to do that. I just said, hey, here's the scene, let's light the scene. And he cut across the scene. He put their faces into shade. And there's those key lights in his eyes, in Ricky's eyes. It's just unbelievably beautiful. But because of those key lights, you can hold those close-ups for a long time. And so what's behind it, the artistry that's behind it, is so complicated. There are so many layers of it. And then, of course, you add into it this hypnotic piece of music by Tom Newman that's glassy and yet emotional, that seems to not move and yet is moving all the time, that has this sort of strange moving strings that at the same time appear to be plateau. And something happens. You know, I look at it and I think it's a very, very strange, dangerously flirting with pretension, very close to being almost parody, and yet somehow you believe it. And the other thing is, he's terrific. I mean, Wes Bentley is terrific in that speech. But the reason he's terrific, well, one of the reasons, I take all the credit, one of the reasons is that he hadn't seen that until he was saying the speech. Mm-hmm. We shot his coverage first because I wanted him to speak for the first time when he'd seen that film for the first time. So that's him watching that film and being moved by what is on the screen. And then we turned around and we just shot that, the hero shot that you see. So much of it was a knife edge in a way, things that shouldn't work, and yet they did. And then 2 very beautiful, very pure actors who were at that time in their life very young. I mean, Thora was 15, I think, just coming into womanhood, just turning point where she goes from child to woman. So there's an innocence there too. And I just think it's one of those things. But I think you underestimate the power of the lighting at one's peril. Mm. To me, I find it unbelievably, you know, and I miss Conrad very much as a person and as a spirit. He died, you know, he shot American Beauty, he won the Academy Award for American Beauty, won it again for Road to Perdition, and then he died before he was able to accept that award of cancer. And he just had he had a poet's spirit. But he was daring, and everything that he did was just slightly unexpected and unconventional, including the lighting in that scene. So for me, it's a good example of when design, cinematography, music, acting, lighting all come together. Mm-hmm. And add up to something greater than the sum of their parts.
Mm-hmm. So comparisons are odious, but if you had to talk about the difference between working with Conrad Hall as cinematographer and Roger Deakins, who you've worked with now on many more films, what would you say their different styles were?
Roger is a master too, but Roger is less concerned with the actor's face and more concerned, and better in some ways, with interiors. So if you look at the way that Roger lit the casino, for example, in Skyfall, it's just, I don't know, just fantastic. You know, but he's buried every light into the, he's had a hand in every single practical light, and there are probably 300 on that set. he has debated every one with the production designer. He knows exactly what bulbs in each one. He's got controls over every one. He's the whole feeling of the set is dominated by Roger. You know, he makes that Dennis Gaston, the production designer's work, look especially glamorous and beautiful and real. He gives it a set. I mean, that's a constructed set, you know, at Pinewood. Although, to tell you a funny story, that set has now been recreated in Macau as a tourist attraction. And along with, by the way, the Day of the Dead parade at the beginning of Spectre in Mexico City, which of course was entirely our creation. And now, because tourists kept turning up to experience the full Day of the Dead, as seen in Spectre, to find like 3 slightly sad shrines with people like they now have. They took all our costumes and all our floats, and they do it every year, pretty much as we staged it. So that's quite odd to discover that, you know, you're now responsible for a national festival. But anyway, I'm not. I mean, actually, the real thing is very beautiful, but it's very low key and doesn't have people dancing in the streets. So anyway, that would be Roger, whereas Connie wouldn't start with the face and work outwards. Roger would start outwards and work to the face, and actors would have never, I never in the movies with Connie ever got an actor saying, could he not like me that harshly? But I did have that a couple of times with Roger, particularly because we were shooting Skyfall on digital. I didn't get that on Revolutionary Road because we shot on film and it was a softer light, summer light. We shot indoors, so it was more controllable. But they're both masters. And what I loved about Roger is that Roger adored Conrad and felt that he was his mentor, but he was his mentor, and so there was a sense of handing down the baton, you know. And Roger himself is is sweet and gentle and shy, but a deeply passionate man about what he does, and in that respect, they're both very much the same.
Is he one of the few English cinematographers who's made such a big name in Hollywood?
Gosh, I don't know actually. I mean, some of the Freddie Youngs and some of the great cinematographers were English. David Lean's cinematographer, obviously. But, you know, he's certainly, I mean, he's now probably the most, him and Emmanuel Lubitsky, who, you know, shot The Revenant and Birdman and all Terry Malick's films, probably the 2 most well-respected, best-known cinematographers, and certainly they're both. And interestingly, Emmanuel Lubitsky also a friend of Conrad's and one of his disciples.
Mm-hmm. One question we didn't touch on was something you have talked about, which is the future of film. And you said that the problem now is there's no middle ground. It's either very small budget, very low budget, or the kind of blockbuster, the huge budget film. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about when and what that loss of the middle ground might be, and is there ever any chance that it could be reclaimed?
Well, the good news is that there are lots and lots of people still going to the cinemas. The bad news is they're going to see a very small handful of films, and they tend to be the event movies. So they tend to be Marvel, Star Wars, Bond, Bourne, X-Men, you know the ones. Pixar. Some of those movies are great, but so the attendance over the course of a year is still high, relatively high, but they're seeing far fewer films. And ultimately, the death of the middle-scale movie is because people don't go and see them anymore, not because someone in Hollywood has decreed that they're not interesting or not fundable. Hollywood will always follow tastes, you know, to a large degree, but because the bottom dropped out of that market, in a sense, it's very difficult to sustain middle-scale movies. Interestingly, some of the larger-scale, more ambitious, or term-driven movies, Dunkirk, Gravity, Life of Pi, The Revenant, they have managed to cross over and become mainstream films, but they tend to be big, experiential, immersive IMAX movies that you need to see in a big, so they're ambitious and they're confident, but they're also made by major filmmakers, of whom there are not that many. The thing that I feel has happened, and I said this earlier in our masterclass, but I'll repeat it, is that in a sense the figure of the director as a cultural figure, as a lone wolf, has diminished significantly since the end of the 20th century. We live now in a golden age of television, and really the pivotal figure in television is the showrunner, is Vince Gilligan for Breaking Bad, or David Simon for The Wire, or Matthew Weiner for Mad Men. These are the figures. They write, they direct sometimes, but they don't always direct. But they oversee, and it is their governing intelligence that is brought to bear over 40, 50, 60 sometimes hours of television over the course of 6 or 7 years. These are the major cultural figures now. And the directors that are famous were made famous 20, 30 years ago. Tarantino, Spielberg, Scorsese, even Chris Nolan, 10, 15 years ago with The Dark Knight. Those figures are becoming less and less, it's becoming less and less easy to make your name as a pure director. You need to write as well, and ideally you don't necessarily work in the movies. So, for example, there was a movie called Creed about 3 years ago. I don't know if anyone saw it. It was a Rocky follow-up, brilliantly directed by a young black director called Ryan Coogler. Absolutely stellar piece of directing. He shot 4 boxing matches in it. They were fantastic. And his next movie was The Black Panther, was a Marvel film. Now, once you've drunk the Kool-Aid, right, of going and doing a big movie and having all the bells and whistles and all the drivers and the money and the da-da-da, right, it's very difficult to go back again. It took me 2 movies to sort of, you sort of get yourself back again, you get your soul back to where you can have some experience of normality, because it's very heady. And it's very difficult to take yourself out of that. So, for example, I was talking earlier also about the shape of story, which I think has, in a sense, changed in the last 15 years. When I was watching movies, when I was growing up watching movies, and the movies I made, the goal was to find a perfect shaped story. A 2-hour movie, Casablanca, Rear Window, 400 Blows, whatever. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now the ideal story has no end. That no studio out there wants a movie with an end. And I know it sounds ridiculous. What they want is a movie with a sort of ending which makes you want to see the next movie. Because the model, that what they're chasing, what they're in competition with, is not The Revenant. It's Game of Thrones. It's Breaking Bad. What they want is a dialogue with the audience that keeps them coming back and back again. And so the shape of story is changing so that you don't really have a third act of a movie. You have a climax, which that's different. That's not the end of the story. It means a big battle, generally speaking. So look at the Black Panther. You've got something involving hardware, in that case a train, and then some big elephants running around. I mean, it's a good movie, but it dissolves at the end into just conventional ending. Even the big blockbusters, original blockbusters, I wasn't a huge fan of Avatar, but you can say that's an original movie. It's come from the mind of a filmmaker. He's got 3 more being made. So the idea is to make a franchise, not to make a single film. And that changes the way that you view films. I was saying earlier that I went with my son, Joe, to see Guardians of the Galaxy 2 or 3 years ago. And he sat next to me, he said, "Dad, who directed this film?" And I said, "I've no idea." And I'm a professional film director. And it was the first time I'd been in a cinema and thought, I've no idea who directed this film. And it was because it wasn't important. Because it's not important anymore who directs a Marvel film. The people in the industry and the nerds understand, but that they follow it. But generally speaking, the general public is not. The director's not the thing. Marvel is the thing. Director's not the thing. Star Wars is the thing. And more and more that's the case. It's the brand is taken over everything. And the governing intelligence with Marvel is Kevin Feige, who runs Marvel, who produces the films. He doesn't direct them. So it's become a very different world, very different landscape. But on the plus side, it is the golden age of television. And if you have an idea, if you are able to think of narrative as in 10-hour arcs, which I'm not very good at. I tend to think of it as a 2-hour chunk because I come from the theatre and I like people to see the whole thing at once in one room. I don't like this feeling that, well, I made 10 hours of television, but I don't really know when they're watching it. They could all watch it at once, or they might watch it in 10-minute chunks and go to the toilet, or they might watch it over the course of a year. I don't know. All I get is a printout on a piece of paper saying, "Oh, good viewing figures." Now, that's just not how. I work and help run a company that makes television, and I care very much about who and how many people watch those shows. But as a director, I can't think of story that goes on that long. I'm sort of lose the thread of it. But also, I think you see what's happening in the less good long-form television is people stringing out narrative for the sake of it. That it actually doesn't stretch. It doesn't need 10 hours. This story can be told in 4 hours or 2 hours if you're really good. David Lean can make Great Expectations and Oliver Twist, and it lasts 2 hours, You know, and he doesn't leave anything out. Oliver Twist, he puts everything in the novel. You know, you can't believe it. It's so compressed. It's such brilliant storytelling. You know, why does it have to last 10 hours, this next version of Oliver Twist or whatever it is? Well, it's because we need product. So I often get sent material and I say, well, this is a great movie. And they go, yeah, but we want 10 hours of television, sorry. And I said, but if you turn it into television, you turn it into a soap opera because you're extending it beyond breaking point. And you're not finding the purity, the shape that lies at the center of it. And they say, we don't mind. We just want to make 10 hours of television because that is that's the holy grail right now.
So do you have any theories about this appetite for the never-ending story? I mean, is it because people are watching in different ways?
I think it has to be bloody good for you to get through to the end. I mean, Breaking Bad is an exception, not a rule. Right? I mean, you can watch 60 hours of that because it's just very, very good. But that is because of Vince. He pushes every... It's also because they had a great central character and they had a very strong central idea. You know, what if this good man turned bad and then he turned into the devil? And it's very simple, but it sustains. You can hang an enormous amount off it. And anyway... Do I think that it will glut at a certain point and then it will diminish a bit, but I think it's here to stay. Mm-hmm. I think it's wonderful that someone can open a laptop and watch 10 hours of a story just made for you, just delivered into your lap. It's incredible. But it's also the death of, or it signals the death of a kind of movie going that we have lived through, that is dying. Mm-hmm. The collective experience of watching a big cultural phenomenon, I think that's going. Mm-hmm. Watching Alone in the Dark with 200 other people and coming out having had the same experience. I think there's something moving about that, but I'm increasingly in the minority and I'm quite old-fashioned.
And the shift from, which was being heralded, the death of cinema with the shift from analog to digital, was that a transition that you felt was dramatic?
Well, there's two things, and there's a big misunderstanding. Shooting on film and projecting on film. Shooting on film still goes on. Quentin Tarantino shoots on film, Steven Spielberg shoots on film, J.J. Abrams shoots on film, Christopher Nolan shoots on film. We shot Spectre on film. That's fine, but it's then put onto digital because there is no more film projection. There are no more projection booths. There are no more spools of film. If you think there are, you're living in the past. There's a tiny little machine and a tiny little disc goes like that. Press go, and that's it. It's like your DVD player. It's no different. It's the projection of film, the movement, the way it vibrates the air, those tiny little stutters, 24 frames a second, and the eye cannot detect darkness between each frame. That's the perfect speed. 20 frames a second, it starts to look like you can see the darkness. And that's gone. The film running through the sprocket, the sound of the film, the feeling of it, it's a real texture. It's a human. It's tactile, and digital is not. And suddenly, there are other issues with digital. There's a harshness to it sometimes. If the projectors are not good, it's very difficult to calibrate. It's very difficult to be consistent with it, and it glitches. So you get little stutter steps. And like last night, I hate to say this about my own film, but it was out of sync. Road to Perdition, image and sound were out of sync. That would not have happened had it been a film projector.
Sure. These
are the things that happen. So there's a whole other set of problems that come with digital, and I think that they'll all be solved. And digital cameras are amazing, and increasingly it's sort of pointless to shoot on film, not because of the way it looks, which is now with certain digital cameras almost identical to film, but the rigmarole of film. Every 10 minutes, the camera operator takes the roll of film off. You have a little break. You put a new one on. It goes to the lab. It gets developed. It gets delivered back. You watch the dailies the next day. People don't know how to handle it anymore. Young crew members literally have never picked up a canister of film in their lives, so they just don't know what to do with it, and they make mistakes. Digital is just it's a disc. And it's all held. I shot 7 months on Spectre. And at the end of the movie, my editor held up a cartridge this big and said, "It's all on there." And I don't know, I was kind of disappointed by that.
It wasn't enough.
I wanted to see piles of film canisters, but no, It doesn't happen anymore.
Okay, so I think perhaps that's a good moment to open out to questions from the audience. I can see a hand there.
There's sort of like a recurring sort of scene in your film with like round tables. So I'm thinking like Away We Go, The Tram.
Oh, yes.
And also Revolutionary Road. And then I saw the Ferryman like a few weeks ago.
Yes, there's a table in that too.
Yeah, well, it's just like you're so good at sort of getting the actors like to build this tension around just like people. Like, how do you do that with the actors? How do you like push them? Because in A Way We Go, it sort of ends in comedy, and I guess because it's like Maya Rudolph and John Krasinski, they have that comedy background. But with the others, it's a lot more sort of tense and serious. But it's sort of that same. How do you get the actors to like get to?
Well, I think that one of the things you learn from the theatre is that the way you can tell stories by the distance you put between people, as much as by their body language. You know, all I can say is you saw a brief flash after that scene in American Beauty where you saw the beginning of that dinner table scene, and we carefully measured the width of that table so that it felt like they were just a hair too far away from each other. Excuse me. So that was a very deliberate choice. It feels like they're sort of acting an idea of family. It doesn't really feel organic, it doesn't feel natural. And the same would go for Away We Go. We made it a table that was just a little bit uncomfortable to be at, a little bit too close to the walls, you know, and that's part of the storytelling. The storytelling goes into the design of the set. In The Ferryman, which is on in the West End at the moment, it's quite the opposite. Everyone's crammed around, they're all shoulder to shoulder, you know, the sense of chaos and everyone at different heights of chair and bench, that's part of the family. That is a functional, dysfunctional family, if you know what I mean, as opposed to a dysfunctional family, which the others that you're talking about are. So, I think that that's one of the things that you bring with you from theatre is the way in which you can tell story by governing space in a room. And I always feel very comfortable in a room when I'm on a film set because I'm used to staging things in a very confined space on stage. It's when you get into big open spaces it starts getting a little scarier. Gentleman over here.
My name's Sean Mukherjee and I'm a film student at SAE Institute Oxford. My question today is soundtrack, music selection. What brings you to the decision of choosing a particular singer or soundtrack for your movie? Like I'm talking about the two films which recently I saw, Skyfall and Spectre. You chose Adele and Sam Smith for Skyfall and Spectre respectively. What brings you to that decision, that point that this is the singer, this is the kind of music I need for the film? Because I feel it's very crucial that music is moving away from film. And I think that's crucial, the music component to the film, the connection. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
The songs for Bond movies, you're asking them to write them and perform them. And that's a bit of a shot in the dark. And I just thought, we all thought Adele was the obvious choice. And we got her in, we handed her the script, and I told her the story. We got her in much earlier than they normally do, and she wrote it very quickly, and it was completely painless. In fact, so was Sam Smith. So that was quite an easy one. You know you're going to you should have the iconic singer of that age singing a Torch song at the beginning of a Bond movie, and I was all willing to embrace that. But the way that you use music in movies is much more complicated. One of the things I find is that I often put together a mixtape, or I end up listening to the same things for inspiration when I make a film. And I always think this is going to be great over this scene, and this song's going to work over that scene, and they almost always don't work. The music you use to inspire you and the music in the movie are often two very different things. It's very rare that the two things go together. Music is the quickest way to dissipate and ruin emotion in a scene, to create fake emotion. It's also, if it's right, it can elevate things far beyond your wildest dreams, particularly a score. And I've been very lucky in that I worked with Tom Newman. Apart from one movie, he's scored all my movies, and I've enjoyed that collaboration massively. He's a wonderful guy. And then at times, it's pragmatic, you know. what can you afford? I mean, American Beauty, I wanted to use Led Zeppelin. They said, thanks very much, that'll be $1 million. And I said, I'm not going to be using Led Zeppelin, you know. And then I asked for a Who track, and Pete Townsend said, can I see the movie? And he did, and he gave it to us for £100 because he liked it. There are some artists, like Dylan, for example, who are very, very open and will encourage you to use their back catalogue because they like to feel that the culture is rediscovering and regenerating their own work. And then there are artists who are very, I mean, the Beatles, you could forget it, you know what I mean? You can't afford it, it's too expensive. So yeah, sometimes it's those choices. But I find, you know, there are people who use it masterfully well, Scorsese being one of them, Tarantino another, but I tend to find that the lyrics of songs tend to distract me when I'm watching a scene, and I care too much about dialogue. And if I mix the song down too far, I can't hear the song. And if I mix it up too far, I can't hear the dialogue. So there's always that, you know, give and take. Lady down the front here.
Looking back to the beginning of your career, where did you see yourself in, say, 10 or 20 years? Did you have a plan to go into film, or was it to stick with the theatre, or did you just kind of go with what came to you?
Again, I was saying this earlier, so anyone who was at the masterclass, forgive me, but I felt like there was no path for the idea of being a film director, being at Cambridge University and becoming a film director seemed impossible because there was no training to be a film director. There were very few examples of people who'd gone on to do it. And all the people that I loved, the English filmmakers that I loved, they'd all gone off to Hollywood, Hitchcock, Lean. You know, they were sort of mythic figures who had somehow, the path to get to where they were was impossible to follow. That said, I fell in love with the theatre, and I obviously dreamt that one day I would have a company. That's what I wanted, I remember, at university. And that became real with the Donmar when I sort of reopened it in the early 90s. And film came out of theatre, my work in the theatre. Eventually I got offered a lot of films. I was offered all the films that people in Hollywood thought theatre directors should do, which tended to be costume dramas and adaptations of plays. And I spent a long time saying, no, I want to make a contemporary film, I want to make an original screenplay. But if you'd asked me where I would have been when I was your age, I wouldn't have had the foggiest idea. I certainly would have been shocked at the path that I ended up taking, and probably delighted and terrified. Yeah. Gentleman over there on the side.
Hi, Sam.
Hello.
You've talked a lot about the state of film, and in particular how you feel about big blockbuster movies surpassing and replacing the director as event history of film. How does it make you feel when you, or what are your feelings towards major directors working on projects like that? So there's stories about Tarantino directing a Star Trek film, about David Fincher working on the sequel to World War Z. What are your expectations for those films?
I think I'm excited by those because I think those are directors who will not be defined by those genre movies. I think you'll watch Tarantino's. I'd be amazed if it happens, but you know, I would love to see Tarantino do a Star Trek movie. It would be his own thing, and then it'd move on. It wouldn't. You'd view it in the oeuvre of Quentin's work. You wouldn't view it as in the oeuvre of the Star Trek movies. I think the same with Fincher. So I don't mind that, but increasingly, you know, those are anomalies. The Christopher Nolan Batman movies are going to seem like, you know, a different age very soon because they are a major filmmaker making it in his own way with no interference from the studio, backed by people who trust him as a filmmaker. And he in that scenario is the driving force. But I think increasingly they don't want people like Chris or people who have final cut like myself or Quentin because they don't want to hand over that control. They want to control the franchise. And fair enough. It's their franchise. They spent years building it, and they don't want it taken over by some cocky filmmaker whose work they can't change. So I think they'll be very rare, those things. But I also think that, as you can see, they're having to change it up so much now. They're having to do these standalone Star Wars movies, and there is a danger of repetition. At a certain point, they have to do new and interesting things and bring in different voices and filmmakers, because otherwise they're just going to get the same movie over and over again. So perhaps it will happen, but I would love it. I don't think it's a bad thing. Lady down here with the glasses on the aisle.
I have a question about the C word, which is conflict. And how do you...
Is that right? I'll remember that.
I believe
Okay,
in this
good.
country it kind of is. I wonder how you deal with conflict on set, which must happen under pressure.
Sorry, it just reminded me of an interview my wife did on stage at the Albert Hall, in which the interviewer said, "I'm going to ask you about the C word." And I thought, oh my God, like that. And she went, and he said, crossover, like this. I thought, I can't, for one moment there, I thought I was saying the same thing. Conflict. How do I deal with conflict?
Yes. I mean, in general, you must have a lot of it. You have egos, you have time pressure, you have budget issues.
I just tell them all they're wrong and get on with it. It depends who it's with. It depends, whether you're punching up or punching down. I think that the truth is you'd be surprised how little there is if everyone's pointing in the same direction. I sound like David Brent, Jesus Christ. But the truth is that I very rarely found myself in direct conflict about something. It generally happens... it generally happens when you haven't resolved it early on with an actor. And if you've rehearsed it, which I do like to do with films, it almost never happens. You have to remember when you work on a movie that often you're working literally with hundreds of millions of dollars and in many cases people's careers and lives on the line. And you need to explain what you're doing with their money. And that sounds really obvious, but I think a lot of filmmakers don't, or feel they're entitled. And I think that you're not entitled. And I think that, again, a lot of conflict is avoided if you can explain clearly what it is that you're doing, or what it is that you hope to achieve. So there's that. Not going in there with your fists already raised does help. But the job of directing is it's mostly talking. I know it sounds obvious, but you talk and talk, and as you can tell, I do it well, or I just do it for long periods. But that negotiation and understanding that everyone is the centre of their own movie. This is, there's the joke about, the two guards in Hamlet, and someone says, what's the play about? And the guy says, well, it's about this guard, and he meets this guy called Hamlet. Well, that's what it is on a movie set. Everyone is experiencing their own movie, that is the grips movie, that is the special effects movie, it's the head of visual effects movie, it's the background artist movie, and you're in control of their journeys, but it's their film too. And I think that with the actors, you quickly learn in theatre, everyone has a different way of working, everyone has a different language, and you have to try and tune in. If you just talk endlessly in your own dialect, some people won't understand it. Some people need challenging, some people need a friend, some people need, the great Mike Nichols said there are some actors who are like horses, you need to put your hand on them to calm them down. And I think that's true. There are some, and you can literally feel them vibrating under your touch. You're calm. It's not a big thing, but it's important sometimes. Sometimes actors you wouldn't touch them in a million years. You can read everything they're saying, stay away. Some actors, before the camera rolls, in a corner, kind of rocking back and forth, humming, muttering to themselves with headphones on like this. And they're on the phone chatting to their agent, yeah, I'll be in a minute, and it doesn't mean either of them are going to give a bad performance. You just have to get them to the same place. You have to bring the guy on the phone up and you have to calm the other guy down, loosely speaking. But the point where the cameras roll, they need to be facing each other. And that's your job. So conflict would be the absolute last resort. Telling someone or arguing with someone about something. Because generally, they've got a reason. They're frightened, mostly. It's almost always fear, particularly with the actors. I just don't want to look stupid, or I care about this too much, or, they've lost perspective. And you have to just intuit that and find another way to undo it, I guess. That gentleman over there with the beard.
Hi. So I don't know if I'll get the technical jargon right, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or perspective on. It seems to me that as movies become more digital, that there are filters that are used. So there's like a really consistent color palette to an entire film, and it seems like it's more now than before. I might be completely wrong, but
No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. It's not filters. What you're referring to, and this is very important that people do understand this, is on the whole what is known as the DI, the digital intermediate. So you have immense control now over the way that colours and images look. You go into a digital suite and you've got your movie and you finish your movie and everything's done, cut, ready to go, and you go in there for about 2 weeks and you can change things within the image to an unbelievable degree. So for example, there's a face in a crowd and you want to pull them out, you can put a light around that face, a halo of light around it, and drop everyone else down. So you can relight the shot. Now, what's happened is in the old days, the studios were very nervous of computer-generated images because they were very time-consuming, very expensive. But as they got more and more available and they've understood them more and more, they will do things like, for example, in the old days, you could say, look, well, I can't shoot the rest of that scene because we've shot the first half in the sunshine and now the sun's gone in and it doesn't match. And they'll say, shoot it and we'll do it in the DI. So often you see somebody timing down, in other words, turning down the sunshine in the sunshine shot and turning up the shade to try and match it. Anyway, the short version is that the overall feeling is that you get a very sort of almost a milky, muted palette thrown over things. And cinematographers in particular get carried away. And there are directors who don't do it at all, like Chris Nolan, for example. And then there are directors who I think do it too much. And I think Roger Deakins is sometimes guilty of doing it too much with the Coen brothers. And I think one of the early movies where I felt it happened a lot and too much was Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Which had a sort of sheen of yellow and weird colours on it, which were not clearly in the set. They had been added in post digitally. So you're seeing a lot of colour correction, digital colour correction on top of images. Sometimes muted, desaturated colours in costumes being made more poppy or primary because they just wanted to jazz up the shot a little bit, or the other way around. So what the eye sees and what the camera is showing you, almost always different. You're really not seeing what it actually looks like. And then they do all sorts of other things. They add smoke in the air or particles of dust or deep background, shadows, shafts of light, birds in the distance. I mean, any number of things. And every time you do one of those, it's like drawing, it's like painting a layer on a painting, just another layer, another layer, another layer, and you lose the original image. And so you do get this feeling that somehow this whole thing is actually a digital creation and not real people. It's almost like an animation feeling. And of course, sometimes it is animation. So, you're looking at the BFG, for example, and the BFG is animated. I mean, that's Mark Rylance's face somewhere in there, but basically his whole being is a mocap, motion capture. He's wearing a mocap suit and he's doing movements, and that's translated into a 60-foot giant. But he's standing next to a little girl who's real, who's being lit to match a computer-generated figure. And the two things don't quite go together. And so you've got a lot of people trying to push things to make them seem organic when they're not. And I think that happens a lot now in movies all over the place, even when you don't have CG characters or CG worlds. And I think that's possibly what you're talking about. Gentleman down here in the pink shirt.
Sometimes music becomes, to me, a defining genre a defining factor for films as well, like Preisner and Kieślowski and Tom Newman and yourself. And I just wanted to ask, what is the process, the creative process? Do you have any influence on the music production? How do you give feedback to the person, or do you give the person a free hand and just let him do the thing?
Good question. What tends to happen is you show them a rough cut, and they go away and think about it. And then with Tom, and he comes back with some rather feeble little sketches, or he sends them to you because he's too terrified to hand them to you in person. Soderbergh describes Tom Newman as like one of those dogs that flinches when you go to pet it. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're trying to be nice to him. He's like, "What do you want? You're going to kill me." That's like Tom. He's a little bit like, I know you're going to hate it, but here it is. So he'll send you and there'll be weird loops and sort of strange little patterns. And, they always sound the same. There's and I'm like, what is this? And then in amongst these funny little sketches, there'll be these one or two absolutely beautiful little sort of pen portraits, just a tune, just floating there. You think, oh, that's good, So you kind of, it's like panning for gold, there's mud, and then there's these little tiny little bits of gold, and you go, oh, I'll put that in the pocket. So you go, I like sketch 7 and sketch 9, and okay. And then he'll go away, and then he'll work up a couple of those sketches, and a couple more will come back. And he's thinking, I'm thinking this for that section. And you get a few pieces that are okay. But generally speaking, at the same time as this, you're also scoring your movie with temp music from other movies composed by Tom Newman, some of them your own. So you're using music from Shawshank Redemption or from Unstrung Heroes or from American Beauty, and you're just using cues that you know. And sometimes it really is write me a cue like that one, but with these things, these adaptations made to it. And so you take the sketches, go in here, and then the existing music goes in, and you kind of begin to work out a pattern. And then you get in the room, and then he starts really working it up. And with Tom, you do have to imagine a lot, because he doesn't, he'll play it on the keyboard, and then he'll say, and strings will come in here, like that, and then there'll be a big pounding bass here, like that. But he won't make any attempt to record it, but you have to imagine it. And then we've got a ticking element here, and then we have shorthand. So he has a small group of players, and he'll say, we'll have a Rick here, and Rick is the guy who does the tones. So he calls it a Rick, for example, and then we'll have a Paul over here. Paul's the high percussion. And I know now what that means because I know the players. And then he has an orchestrator. So with the bigger pieces, I noticed a name came up on the Road to Perdition, Julian Bratislav, who was his old Russian orchestrator. And then Tommy, what the hell was his name? He's gone too now. Anyway, the orchestrators are pivotal because they really, they take what is basically a theme. I mean, he'll describe to them what they need. And they do magical things. And then you sit, you go from this slightly wonky synth imagined score, and you've got it in your ear, but you know the shape of it. And then you go to Abbey Road or to the Newman stage on the Fox lot in LA, or one of the scoring stages at Paramount, and there's 80, 70-piece orchestra, and Tom's at the podium and he conducts it, and the music starts and you burst into tears. It's every time. Just the sound of those people going, and the fact that they're all there for your film. It's incredibly moving. And in Fox, in fact, the old Fox stage, they still now project the movie onto the wall. So the players can see it too, which I find really wonderful. They don't do that anymore. Abbey Road, you're watching it on monitor screens in the booth, and they don't really see what they're accompanying. But I find it's incredibly exciting, and it's always the best bit. And it is always beyond what you imagine. With Tom, he always surpasses expectations, and I've learned that now, that whatever you imagine, he's going to go one better. And then there'll be pieces that feel a bit wonky in the room, and you have to go out and give a note or call him back in and make adjustments, or say there's too much percussion here because there's dialogue and you've forgotten that. There's off-camera dialogue, you can't see it, but remember there's this here. Oh yeah, I've forgotten that. And then you start stripping it out. And then you have another chance when you get to the dubbing stage and you're putting the sound and the music together to start to pare down if the music's too thick, too rich, too much of a wash over existing elements. The balance of sound and music is the most difficult thing to achieve, particularly in a music-heavy film, because they have to occupy the similar space, but you tend to push the music out here and the sound in here, so the two things can coexist. But in smaller spaces, they get pushed closer together, and you have to. So, for example, there are very few dubbing stages left in England, There's only one sizable one at Pinewood. So when we were dubbing the last two Bond movies, which was in Soho, we had to every morning take the movie out of the stage, which is probably a third of the size of this room, and into the Odeon Leicester Square at 8 o'clock every morning to hear it in a big room. And it sounds totally different. The air moves differently. It's spatially different. Obvious, it's a much bigger space and the speakers are further apart. And then take it back to the room, imagining what it would sound like in a big theatre. So it can be very complicated, but it's such a pleasurable experience because it comes right at the end. And so I associate it with the finishing of a film and the joy of that feeling of like you're nearly there. And it's just like a big gift at the end. So I love it.
I'm going to ask us to end on that big gift because our time is up, but please do join us, and I'm sure Sam will be happy to talk more. But can we thank him hugely for really an enormous gift that he's given us over these last 2 days, for wit, for insight, and just for general brilliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.